Welcome, everyone. My name is Michael Reichley Lancaster. I'm the Executive Director Curator of the Mississippi Valley Textile Museum in Elmont. And I'd like to start off this virtual lecture by acknowledging that the land on which the museum stands is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Thank you for also participating in our virtual Fiberfest. This is the second year in a row we've had virtual Fiberfest, and we are really hoping it's our last year of fully just virtual Fiberfest. We're really hoping for 2022 to have in person again. So we look forward to hopefully seeing you next year for that. But I wanted to now introduce Tracey-Mae and Chambers. I'm so excited to have you here, and it was really exciting to meet you on Friday. We had such a good time, lots of laughs, but also lots of good discussions. Very poignant, and a lot that will people will hear about today as well when you go through your presentation. So I'm not going to say too much until the end myself. I would like just hand it over to you, Tracey.
Thank you. Thanks, I appreciate it. And I was really appreciative of the invitation to come to work there too, obviously because of the museum itself being a textile museum, but also the location is so poignant and just so beautiful. It was such a beautiful town and a beautiful area. So, I want to welcome everyone who's attending tonight. I appreciate it very much, and as does, I'm sure, the museum. So thank you for stopping by to chat. And I hope you have lots of questions at the end, but I'm going to ask one thing. I've never done this before. Yes, I've done a Zoom call before, but I've never done a presentation on it. So this is my very first time. So please be patient. So I'm hoping there'll be no technical glitches. And if there is, we're going to blame Ryan. So, let's.
I mean, that's fair.
Okay. And no, it wouldn't be your fault. It would totally be my fault. So the installation that's at the museum right now, I've named the hashtag is Hope and Healing Canada, and I've named it the hashtag just because it was easier to, instead of using it as a title, using it as a hashtag all in one, so that it was easier to find online. So we'll just go ahead and get started here. So I began this project when I decided to address the myriad of emotions I was feeling around May and June of 2021. Our numbers in Hamilton were still going up. It was still sort of a rough time here, and certainly around the rest of the country. And we were at that point where we were thinking the lockdown might end and things might start to be moving into some sort of normality. And at that time, I found myself lacking direction and motivation and was wondering how to tap back into my creative self because I felt so drained, as I'm sure all of you did. So just to give it to some context, okay, I just want to make sure the photo credit was showing. So I wanted to, I realized that I wanted to create a body of work, and I wanted it to address these feelings that I was dealing with. So I wrote them down and tried to figure out how to work through that. So I know a lot of you will have felt these feelings, and I'm sure to different degrees, and other ones that I haven't included here, but this is what I was feeling. And I haven't rated them in order or anything like that, so don't think that that's what it is. It's just, this is what I was feeling. So obviously hopelessness due to what was happening in the world, and certainly what was happening in my own community and communities close to me. I was having trouble with depression due to the isolation from my family, my sons especially. I had a really hard time with that, as I'm sure a lot of you did as well. And I was sort of, maybe again, like some of you, really addicted to the numbers. So the fear about COVID and some of my elderly family contracting it was really on my mind. And every day I wanted to know what the number was. And I found myself really fearful, and anger surrounding the level of racism within our society was starting to really be more visible, because people were home, and we were all home, and we were noticing it in a different way. And sadness over the discovery, and I did put that in quotes because I feel like it's not really a discovery, considering that anyone who is Indigenous, Métis, or Inuit knew that there were grave sites there for obvious reasons, of these kidnapped Indigenous children. I know that some people use the verbiage of abandoned or lost, but I consider them kidnapped children. And confusion about how to decolonize my mind and spaces was also on my mind when I was trying to figure out how to create a new body of work and what to create specifically. So I want to address colonization or decolonization right at this onset, so that as we work through some of the photos, it'll make more sense, hopefully. So I'm trying to communicate the idea of how human connections, while addressing the lack of connection between settler communities and Indigenous, Inuit, and Métis people, which I wasn't sure how I was going to do that. But anyways, I think I'm have been successful with that, but I mean, we can talk about that afterwards. I find myself deconstructing my own ideas about the superiority and privilege of colonial and Western ideas and world views as a Métis who certainly white. I mean, I certainly look like a white woman. Yeah. So I was looking inward at how that benefits me. And I don't know what the process is going to look like in the greater world, but I can place these installations on and in venues that are traditionally occupied by colonial worldviews. And as we go through the places that I've done these installations, that'll become apparent. And I look at my work and I try to think about the unbalanced power dynamics in our civilization. And again, that'll show itself as we're going along. The hope and healing portion of it, the name, the only way to remain hopeful is to acknowledge these issues. The only way to heal them is to attempt to resolve them. The history of colonization is yet another thing that connects us all. So not only are we connected through things like our shared experience of COVID-19, but this, all the events that have happened because of residential schools and the discoveries is another thing that connects us, whether that's guilt or shame or sadness or any of those feelings that are associated with it. So I started with my own spaces. So the photograph on the left is our living room. And I shrouded all of that, the photos and the things that I purchased and some of my grandmother's things, which are on the left. One of my own sculptures is at the top. So although it doesn't show as significant, when you take it apart, each one of those pieces in this photograph are chosen specifically as I'm decolonizing myself. So it was really a sort of self-medicating, perhaps, of me taking apart my own life and then putting it back together again to identify what colonization means to me. The other one is in an empty parking garage, which is actually the garage of the place where I live, because it's mostly empty, or it was mostly empty when I created this. So I wanted to start in my own spaces. Art galleries are traditionally unwelcoming spaces to marginalized people. And what I mean by that is I don't think, in my mind, I don't think that art galleries are necessarily a place where someone of color or Indigenous or anything, any label that we may apply, I don't think it's a place where they necessarily felt that they were welcome in, quite literally. And so this one is one of the first ones that I did, which is at the Grimsby Public Art Gallery. And some children had made the wooden branches that are there for another art installation that had been there that some children had, put together. And I found this was really interesting because it almost looks like A, a teepee, and B, like the beginnings of a fire. So I started with it and I wound my way out, and it's hard to see in this photograph, and I'm very sorry about that, but it actually looks like a tornado. And yeah, so it was like the center of the tornado is this teepee, so outside of this art gallery. And so that's how I wanted to show that even though it's not a very elaborate way of decolonizing, me just being there and taking those things apart and looking at them from an Indigenous worldview, saw that as a teepee and created this whirlwind around it of ideas and identity and how to decolonize. Then one of the other places that I did it in the early days was Riverbank Art Gallery, which is in Queenston. And I'm glad that they invited me to work there, because it's not always acknowledged that First Nations warriors and Métis fighters fought alongside the British soldiers and settlers against the American forces that were trying to invade. So I was glad to be able to work there and think about those people that were there fighting and how they felt about who they were fighting for, even though they were fighting alongside people who were less than kind to them. Yeah, and yeah, so we'll address that a little later on. So this was a pretty big deal, and I didn't realize that that photo was slightly askew. So not that long ago, I was at the Black Creek Pioneer Village, and the curator brought me to this schoolhouse, which is actually the template for Ryerson, who used it as what he wanted residential schools to look like. So people credit him, and truly, truly enough, he did design the public school system, which is great, but he also was one of the people who were spearheading residential schools for Indigenous. So I felt it was a great place for me to do an installation. And I have to tell you, this was a really hard place for me to work in. I had a really, really rough time. Because all I could think about, sorry, all I could think about when I was working here was the little people in these desks. And I had a really tough time with this place, because I felt like the seats are vacant, and they're vacant because these kidnapped children are the survivors, but the ones who didn't come home. And so I built a longhouse over top of them, which is hard to see in this photograph. It's a small room, and I don't have a zoom lens, so I wasn't able to get a wide view at it. So I'm sorry about the photo quality. But when you are there, you can visually see that it is a longhouse. And this authority that's at the head of the room is this very dense tangle of, to me, colonialism, where the chair, and I've suspended that chair from the ceiling, and it's above the children, as is the desk, of course, but above everyone in the room. And it goes right to the ceiling. And then the cut pieces I've left on the desk, and then I actually strung the string between the desks and between the children's desks and the authority in the room, and cut them, because I don't think there was ever a connection between those two things. And I'm not trying to illustrate that the connection is broken. I am confrontationally saying I don't think it ever existed. So there's these two piles of string, one by the children and one by the colonizer. This installation is at Craft Ontario in Toronto, and I'm so glad that they asked me to come, because when you walk through, and there's a fair amount of Inuit sculpture there, which is beautiful, but I look at it as such a marketable item, and yet the people who are, and who I know personally, who are creating some of these pieces are paid very little. And that's also part of how Canada was colonized, right? So I enjoyed working here. I truly did. And I actually am quite proud of these two installations, but that was what I was thinking about when I was working there, was about this sort of taking advantage of someone who's creating work and then selling it at a much higher value. And I found that some of the places, the very structure of the space can be an unwelcoming place for those who have traditionally not had access to it. So this particular gallery has these heavy columns at the front of it, and you have to go up quite a number of stairs to get to it. And it's this imposing place where it's like, I'm not sure if those red strings are welcoming you in or keeping you out. And that's what I felt like this is the Carnegie Gallery in Dundas. So I'm not sure about that juxtaposition here with this particular gallery. And it is, please know that I'm not attacking the gallery specifically. I'm looking at the spaces from an Indigenous worldview, and how do I feel walking up to this place, and what does it say to me, either negative or positive. And I try, the reason there's site specific installations is because this is, when I get here, that's what I decided to do, right? It could have been something totally different, but this is what I decided to do at this space, specifically because of the imposing nature of coming up off the street and into this space here. So why shapes? So I started crocheting and knitting these, which I had to learn how to do, by the way. And I know I'm not very good at it, but I'm trying. So these specific, I wanted to make shapes or denser places that that can sort of, in my mind, illustrate families or family groups, or for some of the larger ones, community. And then you have all these tangle of yarn that comes out, radiates from them, which is essentially what our world is, right? Where we may have our family unit and our friend unit, and we keep working out from that, and until the entire world is covered with web yarn, where we are connected, where whichever way we, whichever direction we look. So I didn't realize this until today, but so this is what, to the left is what I end up with when the gallery send it back to me, or I take the installation down myself. And then I actually do, I think the other day somebody questioned whether I actually do that. And yes, I do, because it seems like it's too much work. And so why would you bother? But so, and I ball them into these balls again, which are all over my house. But it's, capitalism is part of how Canada was colonized, and this reuse of this material is like the anti-capitalist view of things, right? Where I should really just throw this away and buy a brand new ball of yarn and work from that. But that's not a practical way of looking at the world, and certainly nor is it an Indigenous way to look at the world. So I didn't know I was doing this, frankly, until today, to look at the two photos up. And I was just going to use this joke, a long or implausible story. And then I realized, wait a second, I'm doing this subconsciously. And I was really happy with that I recognized that I can't even, it's a small, tiny little thing, but it's me, striving to bust up that decolonized view that I have. Or I'm sorry, my own colonized view, and trying to tear that down, literally tear it down, and sew it back together again into something that actually makes sense to me. So it was hard for me to find a photo of the Mississippi Textile Museum that was the same tone, and so I didn't want to Photoshop it or change it at all. But so this is the sort of the before and after of these two windows. Of which I was really happy with afterwards. There'd been some conversation outside about whether or not to connect these two windows. And it was really great. I loved that we talked about it because, or originally I wasn't going to, then I talked to one person I was going to, then I talked to another person I wasn't going to, because I wasn't sure if I wanted to keep it as two separate entities or bind it together as though it was a more cohesive like illustration of that community. But I'm glad I left it separate, because it's still, we're talking about that separation between settlers and Indigenous, Inuit and Métis. So I'm glad that I left it the way that I did. And maybe that was the wrong choice, but I do feel good about it. So I hope that if you're able to go and see it during Fiber Festival or look at it online, I hope you will. And while I was there, actually, somebody asked me about why I wasn't using a different color because it'd show up better. And it really isn't about it showing, it's not about beauty. It's not about it looking pretty. It's not about it standing up against the flowers that are there, or the color of the building. It's the color red is specific. I chose it specifically. And so I've been asked a couple of times by different venues to change the color, which I refuse, obviously, because it loses its relevance. So I understand that it gets lost in the windows sometimes, and I'm okay with that, because the fact that the string is hard to see is good, because it mirrors the fact that Indigenous people, Métis people, Inuit people are invisible to Canadians. And not all Canadians. I'm not pointing a finger saying no one in Canada sees us, sees them. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that there is a relative invisibility. So I understand that's confrontational. I'm not trying for it to be confrontational. I'm just saying that that's how I see it. So red to me is the color associated with blood, passion, anger, love. It represents courage, danger, or power, and it's obviously a racial slur. And that's why I used this color. So that when I'm representing that connection, or those connections that we have with one another after COVID, after what has happened with residential schools, after racial problems that are happening in Canada and certainly abroad, the color is incredibly important to me, and incredibly important to the relevance of the project, I think, as well. And if anyone has any comments about that, I'd love to hear them, because it gives me some context too about how people are viewing the project as it travels the country. So here's some of the other photos of some of the other places that I've constructed in. Most of them are art galleries, museums. The one that's the tree is an old tree, which is really interesting. This tree is on Lake Ontario, and it's toppled over to the side. It's a willow, and the roots are exposed. And while I was there, someone came up to me, an older person came up to me and said, what's really strange is, and he brought me aside and he pointed out into the water and he said, do you see that concrete out there? And I said, yeah. And he said, that was the base of a cottage. And I was confused by that. And he said, yeah, because the water level has changed so dramatically and that cottage isn't there anymore, but this tree was from that cottage property. And it was funny because to me, while I was creating there, I was thinking about the fact that that cottage, and it was an old cottage, he said it was very old, just a shack essentially, was on land that was Indigenous land. So it was just a weird thought to me. And so I was really happy creating in this particular tree, which was just by happenstance. Yes, and so these photographs just illustrate how dense I try to make some of the installations to illustrate that connection, that although there's some parts of the installation that is quite dense, and then it spreads out. They all spread out into single strings, which is essentially those strings between strangers and go out into our greater communities.
So thank you so much, Tracey-Mae. I'm again so humbled, and excited that you agreed to come to our community to do this project and then share with us even more insight into the work you're doing. And it certainly is hope and healing. And I think it also, there's beauty within it, which is also really exciting. So I'd like to now open it up to questions. So if anyone has questions, you can either raise your hand or speak up, or write it in the chat room if you like.
So do I just click on the chat and then I can see what that one is for? That's
no,
okay.
I can.
That's you.
Will,
okay.
Yeah, I'll
Got
keep
it.
that and
Okay.
ask any questions that come up.
Got it. Okay.
One question from the chat here. Do you have any advice yourself on how to go about decolonizing one's own mentality?
Good Lord, no. No, yes. That's cheeky of me, but like it's a big deal. It's not when you try to take apart a puzzle one step at a time and then put it back together, it's time consuming. And I think it's really hard to identify those things, like buying new thread because I'm done with that yarn, sorry, not thread. When I'm done with it, you don't think of that as being something that's part of capitalism. You don't think about that. You just think about buying new yarn, right? So I think it's sometimes just simplistic things, simple things that we take for granted or don't even notice. Certainly like something like white privilege, and maybe that's something to look at too. Look up what white privilege means, and a lot of times there'll be an actual list, and you can actually say, yes, I've never had to feel this. Yes, I've never had to, or rather, no, I've never had to feel this or this. And sometimes that's a good starting place as well. But as far as how to start it in your own mind, I think it's acknowledging that it's not your fault, but we all share in the responsibility of addressing where we stand right this moment. And I don't know how to do that. I mean, I can only deal with my own space. I can only deal with my own self. I can't change it on a broader scale, perhaps, but those little tiny things working towards it maybe can, and us talking about it, maybe that's part of it too, is just even talking about it. Maybe that didn't answer your question. I hope it did.
Another question from Deanna in the chat. Wondering if you could expand your thoughts on how art galleries and museums can aid in making their spaces more welcoming and accessible and help break down the barriers that colonization has built up.
Hi, Deanna, and I'm sorry that I didn't acknowledge the person that asked the first question, and I'm sorry about that. I'm not an incredibly educated person, so I can't, it's hard for me to know how a gallery can do that, but I do know that one of the things that has plagued me in my career is the question, don't you do any Indigenous art? And I can't name the number of times that I've had that happen. My husband probably could, because I come home and complain about it. But and it's hard for me not to be confrontational with something like that as well. If I do it, it's Indigenous art. If I do it, it's Métis art. It doesn't, a traditional, I don't know, piece of beading is not necessarily a traditional Métis piece of art. That's a French piece of art. So I'm not going to say what an art gallery can do or can't do to help those things. All I can say is that showing authentic Indigenous art would be one step, and having more Indigenous art exhibited would be great as well. And not just the, Monkmans of the world, like down in your own communities, there are massive amounts of artisans and artists within a community that are Indigenous, that it would be great to see them in galleries that are not Woodland Cultural Center. So like Indigenous art started a couple of days ago at Woodland Cultural Center, and that is one of the most, like the largest in Canada. and it happens once a year. So, but I don't see that reflected in other art galleries. So I think something like showcasing Indigenous artists is a big thing. And I also think when you look at what is contained within the gallery itself, maybe that needs to be just deconstructed as well, because a lot of those pieces have a lot to do with colonialism as well. So, but that's for a scholar to say. I can't look at a gallery and say, I feel, you know, unwelcome, because I don't, because I present as white. So I can't say that, but I think that the Ontario Arts Council and the Canada Council for the Arts certainly speak about it on both their websites about how that can happen, decolonizing spaces. And I think they're a great reference point for something like that. If you want to check those out, I know that they have research on their websites that would be able to answer those questions certainly better than I can. Actually, and Michael, you may or Melanie, you may have ideas about this as well. That you know, it's not. I'm looking at the gallery through an artist lens, not through a curator's lens or a director's lens. I don't know like how that would work for an institution like that.
I find it's connecting with your local regional representative or chief for your local area, and working with them, but also putting the truths out there that you learn on the way. And because I feel museums, it's very important to tell truths of history and not just the stories that have rose-colored goggles that you're seeing through. And there's hard stories to tell, and it's not always easy, but it's important to be truthful in telling history.
Agreed, yeah. Does that answer your question at all, Deanna? Or does it, I hope it provides some sort of place to go from here.
Yes, she says, thank you very much, it does. So, unfortunately, she couldn't speak on her microphone because her microphone wasn't working, so.
Oh dear, oh my goodness, okay. I'm sorry, Deanna.
Anyone else have questions or comments?
I have one comment here that was forwarded to me. This comes from Heather. I found the whole presentation fascinating and really enjoyed hearing your explanation and reasoning behind the installs. I especially found the art gallery installation in the doorway interesting because I would never have seen that as something keeping the door closed, only as the strings ready to open them up for everyone. Very interesting indeed. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, I'm sorry, did we get a name on that one?
That one is from Heather Milton.
Oh, Heather, yes, I did hear that. So that is super interesting. I'm glad. So that's something for me to note, that I wasn't showing, or I wasn't successful in making it look like those doors were being held open. So maybe the radiation should have been the opposite direction so that it felt, or tied them together or whatever, because that is honestly how I felt when I was, you know, I tried to stand and look at the space to see what to do with it. And that's immediately what I thought of. So I'm glad it resonated with you. That makes me super happy. But I'm also glad that it made you think it was welcoming, because that's success too, right? If you were looking at that space and saying, I want to go in it, I'm happy with that. Even if it's not how I feel, I'm happy you feel that way, because I want people to feel like they're welcome in art galleries. And I don't want it to be intimidating, which it is. I think I've never not been intimidated going into an art gallery. Never. There's one next door. I live like one street away from the Hamilton Art Gallery. It's not because they want to make me feel unwelcome. It's because I've habitually felt that way. It's not anybody, you know, they're lovely there. It's not that like they made me feel that way and didn't want me there. It's the way I feel going into an institution. So going into an institution like an art gallery, I should be specific about that. So thank you, Heather.
And we have another question from Kaylin here. How might we go about forming positive connections with Indigenous peoples in both a personal and general sense?
I think things like just attending a powwow or attending an Indigenous event. Like this past weekend was a celebration of nations at the First Ontario Centre in St. Catharines. It's a yearly event, and it has workshops like how to make moccasins and how to like things like that, but also has drumming and singing and children's drumming and women's drumming. And storytelling. And that is all part of decolonization as well. And so just even going to that, and people will talk to you. That's just, it just is. So when you go there, they want to know, are you in a school close by? Are you, because when I was creating there yesterday, I spoke to everybody that came up to talk to me, and they were also happy to be there. And if you go, people will talk to you. The artists that are there talk to you. The drummers, they will talk to you. And that, it's as simple as that. That sounds so simple, but really it's just go and attend an event. I know things are closed down right now, but there are events that are happening. There may be less people allowed in, but they are there. And there were lots of people there yesterday. Even though it was rainy, they moved it inside, which was a logistic nightmare for them. They did, and it was so nice to see people there. But that's the kind of thing like to attend and make some personal connections. But you can right in your own community. I know that in your community, I met, who did I meet? I'm sorry, Melanie. There was a lady that came to talk to me. She was head of the like the women's organization there, an Indigenous woman. And I'm so sorry that I can't remember her name. But you know, right in your own community, there would be women's organizations or Indigenous organizations that you can reach out to or go to.
Our is the head of Interboards.
Thank you. Yes. So, and also, I'm sorry, what was I saying? Oh, yeah, I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. But there's all sorts of events that you can attend or go to an Indigenous art exhibition, like actually attend it and go and see, because the artists are almost always there, or maybe not all of them, but a lot of them are there. Actually, the artist talk for Woodland Cultural Center is tomorrow night. So if you want to, there's a good place to start. Go and listen to an Indigenous artist talk at Woodland Cultural Center. And I'll try to find the link to that and send it along to you guys, if that's okay. And honest to God, there's a place to start. Easy peasy.
Tracey-Mae, I'd just like to touch on the earlier discussion and the question about whether the threads, you felt the threads were either kind of creating a welcoming sort of impression, or whether they were kind of being restrictive. And I think that's one of the most interesting things about your work, is that thread, which is, I mean, physically it's soft, it's warm in its kind of usual context as a knitted garment or something. But within this context, it really beautifully illustrates the tension, I think, that exists within the issue of decolonizing and trying to get rid of institutionalized racism. And so I think you've been really, the pieces are just really, really successful in communicating that to me.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's
while also being just absolutely beautiful to look at.
Thank you. And I'm glad of that, but when I'm creating them, I'm really not thinking about beauty. Like I don't know how to explain that. I know it's a strange thing, because the man who handles my functional and caustic work says it doesn't have to be pretty, it has to be interesting, right? And I love that, because I don't know what it is, but I always want to make it pretty and to try to stop doing that is really difficult, I think, for an artist to say, okay, this doesn't have to be pretty. I wanted to, one thing that you said about the softness and the warmness of the yarn, if you look at the photograph of that's up on the screen, this is actually at Bayfront Park in Hamilton. When I wrote about this piece after I did it, I wrote about the right angles, or the angles, sorry, because it's thread, or I'm sorry, it's yarn. You shouldn't be able to get these angles with yarn. And then I thought, but there's angles, and then there's round within the angles, which is the stitches. And I loved that. And I wasn't sure how to articulate that in the PowerPoint, but that's what I thought about it when I see this. This was one of the first times that I've made this particular creation out of crochet and then pulled it apart so that it would be these angles, because I wasn't sure how to get straight lines, right? And this worked, but it was these family units that are they keeping people out? Are they letting people in? But they're stuck together, which are these stitches, right? So yeah, I appreciated the warmth and the softness too, because I hadn't thought of it that way either. I'd only thought about it in the context of the family units and the connections with communities. So I appreciate that. I'm gonna have to write that down. I'm gonna have to keep making note of that. Thank you.
So I do have, I'll speak up unless Ryan was going to. Another great comment here from Kaylin. You asked for our views on the use of red yarn. Mm-hmm. Personally, they feel that the deep symbolism with the blood, especially given the discoveries of the children and the Indigenous and children's blood on their hands.
Yeah. Oh, wow. Geez. Oh, well, okay, that's very powerful. Yeah. Honest to God, I can't. It's Kaylin?
Kaylin, yeah.
Kaylin. Kaylin, the videographer?
Yes.
Oh, hello, Kaylin. You know what? That is obscenely good, the blood on their hands thing, because like I have a hard time talking about that Ryerson School, as you may or may not have noticed. I have a really, really hard time to keeping control of myself. And I have a hard time thinking that far about it. Like I can't address that blood on the hands thing because I get so emotional about it, right? So, but it's a great way to say that. I just can't say it or I would start bawling. So, but thank you for saying it, because I really appreciate it when someone can say things that I can't, because I just can't.
Well, I'm not, Ryan, are you trying to speak, Ryan?
No, I was just waiting to see if any other questions or comments come up in the chat.
Okay, it doesn't seem like there is. I don't know if there's anyone else wanted to speak up or put their comments in or questions in the chat, because if not, we're probably going to close off momentarily. So I just want to again thank Tracey-Mae Chambers and for number one, coming to our community and sharing this project with us and putting yourself out there in this way, because it has been quite the journey the last year and a half, 2 years, with so many things, so many aspects, whether the lockdowns, but even more so to me, the remains. And I think it is poignant saying history does have blood on its hands. And it is very poignant that these things are coming to light, and it's hard stories. It's hard things that many have already known was there, and people don't often want to hear it. And it's good that we're having these discussions and engaging in our communities in this way. And I thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate that. I really do. Sometimes it's tougher than others.
And I thank everyone for joining in. And we have recorded this session, and we're also going to have Tracey-Mae back for future discussion as well. So thank you, everyone, and keep connected with us, and we will share more down the road.
Thanks, everyone. I appreciate it.